Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Fisher, and welcome to our channel, our Scientology Stories Peeling the Onion. And we've got a special video for you today. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce my co-host, Janis Gillham Grady. G'day, Janis.
G'day, Mark. Aloha.
Aloha.
How are you?
And salute. I'm good. I'm good. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Yep. Hopefully my puppies will stay quiet. I've got them settled down and we can get through this without them getting up. But, today I'm real excited about the person we're interviewing today. I met him many years ago when he was researching a book. He's a fellow Aussie. He's an Australian reporter. He was with ABC down in Australia doing Europe. He was the chief of the Europe Bureau. And he was a host of The Drum and a reporter of Late Line. And he is an author of a book on Scientology in which I mentioned my sister and our family. And he also was one of 3 authors that were who were on the short list for the Walkley Award, which is an Australian award. And right now he's actually reporting on the Ukraine war. So this is very exciting. And his name is Steve Cannane. And here's his book. And we're going to talk about his book and other things going on in Steve's life. Hi, Steve. G'day.
Hi, Steve.
G'day. G'day, Mark. Great to see you both.
Great to see you too. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing right now. And you're actually in the UK, right?
That's right. It's nighttime here in London. I've just done a day's work. I'm preparing for another trip into Ukraine in the coming weeks. And I've spent a fair bit of time doing that in the last 18 months, but also covering all of Europe for the ABC, which is a bit like the Australian equivalent of the BBC. It's a public broadcaster. So when I was working for a program back about 12, 13 years ago when I first started getting into Scientology stories. I've reported on lots of different things, but that was a topic that I really kind of got my claws into in a sense. It started with one story and it just kept going. So I've done lots of things over the years. I've been a journalist or a producer or a presenter for over 25 years for the ABC. And I just think telling stories about Scientology and shining a light on it are really important. And I think it's really great what you guys are doing too, because it's a social history what you're doing. That's really important to document that stuff. And when
Right.
Janis said she was mentioned in my book, Janis, I would say featured in my book.
Here's Steve's book right here. Fair game, Steve Cannane. Cannane, right?
Yeah, that's right. And Janis's family is a very important family in Australian history and Scientology, and extraordinary stories that I was able to get from Janis and her sister Terry and her brother Peter and her father Peter as well, about their whole family and the importance of Yvonne in Scientology history through the Celebrity Centre, Janis's mother. And they were real pioneers in Scientology in Australia. And Janis saw it all up close with L. Ron Hubbard and the Apollo and everything. So it's great that Janis, as a witness to that history, is now on this YouTube channel telling those stories and also talking to other people and yourself.
Exactly.
Too.
Yeah, no, exactly. Janis, since the age of 12 or whatever, 13, I can't remember which one it was. But I mean, nobody really spent more time with L. Ron Hubbard on a daily basis, except maybe one other person, Annie Broker, before he died. But Janis was with him 6 hours a day, 7 days a week for, 12 years, a long time.
Well,
So.
And my sister Terry.
Terry too. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's right. They're kind of like the OG of Scientology in terms of connection with Hubbard. And then, of course, we were all around with David Miscavige, too, when Janis was there when he first got into the Sea Organization. And then I worked for David Miscavige the last 6 years that I was in the Sea Organization. And then we finally left in 1990. And because of the abuses that were getting a little too much, and we decided to move on. So that's kind of like our sort of history as far as that goes. But thank you, Steve. That's very nice of you to say about our channel, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to tell the history and also report on the abuses as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. So how did you get, like, do you remember how you got involved in Scientology or heard about it, or, you know, how did that happen?
It was by complete accident. So I'm working on a late night TV current affairs show, always looking for a news story. And somebody came up to me and said, they'd just done a big program called Scientology, the X-Files, on a program in Australia called Four Corners. And if anyone wants to watch that, it's about 15 years old now, but it was very good. And it was the early days of, I would say, the media pushing back against Scientology in that era, and starting to and those reporters had the private investigators on them and everything, so they copped a lot of pushback. And so this reporter who did the program, Quentin McDermott, said, I've got a couple of stories that I think it's worth you following up on. I didn't get time to fit them in this program. There are a couple of leads I think you should follow up. One story was about a woman called Carmen Rayner, who had been, as an 11-year-old girl, abused by her Scientology stepfather. And she'd been coached to lie to police and community services to cover up that crime against her. And she'd also been told that it was her fault, that she'd pulled it in from a previous life, to use Scientology terms. So I did a story on her, but also a story on Scarlett Hannah, who was the daughter of the president of the Church of Scientology at the time in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
And she grew up.
I remember that.
Yeah, and she grew up in the cadet org. And I remember her telling us what it was like. So the cadet org being the junior version of the Sea Org for children at the time. I don't think it exists anymore, but they would. But she talked to me about. She talked to me about being treated like cattle growing up, and what that was like growing up in the cadet org. So I really knew nothing about Scientology, and after I did those stories, the blowback from Scientology was immense. They were threatening to sue me before the program went to air. They threatened to sue me, threatened to injunct the program. So in other words, trying to stop it going to air. Bombarded my boss with complaints. Also, the ABC has a complaints process, so these kind of letters started flowing in. Also, they tried it during the process of me making these stories. They made it very difficult for me. So they would say that they were available for interview, and then they'd pull out at the last minute. And then when they did put someone up for interview, and I was giving that person a hard time, and I mean that in a legitimate way, like asking them tough questions, they had somebody who was filming it, and they said, oh, my batteries have run out. I've got to change my batteries from my camera. So they were trying to give that person some time to compose themselves, which is very unusual behavior. So at every step of the way, they were trying to make my life very difficult. And to me, that just made me think, whoa, you guys have got a lot to hide if you're trying to stop me from doing this. And I just thought, you're not going to stop me. I'm going to keep going. So that one story led to 2 stories, led to about 10 stories on that program. And then I ended up writing this book.
Steve, I was going to ask you, had you ever run into that type of pushback before, as intense as what you did with Scientology at that time?
No way. Not the constant bombardment of legal threats, complaints to a program, the amount of people involved with those complaints. So it was a full-scale operation, which Scientology is famous for. And I didn't really know it at the time. And I learned a lot about it after I started reading Hubbard's documents and about his policies, about how to deal with the media and all of that, and his manual of justice and all of that. I'd never experienced that. And I've subsequently met journalists over the years who just go, boy, what were you thinking taking them on? And in fact, there's a Sunday Times journalist I spoke to, a former Sunday Times journalist, who told me that one of his editors one time said to him, this is probably 2 decades ago, go and do stories on Northern Irish paramilitaries, but don't touch the Scientologists. So they had that reputation. I have to say, when I was doing those stories, they didn't have the foot soldiers in Australia to harass me in the way they would have harassed American journalists over the years, or British journalists. And also, you know, it wasn't like the Paulette Cooper days, you know, where somebody's whole life gets destroyed. It wasn't like that. So I didn't cop much, but it still was significant compared to what I was used to.
You know, I was talking to a friend just the other day who had been in the Guardian's office in Denmark. And before he became the assistant Guardian, he was working on a campaign against Interpol and getting press and that type of thing out on Interpol. And he met someone who had done a report about Scientology, and this was in France, and found out this person had been beaten in a park and told, do not write reports on Scientology. And then when he went to Worldwide, where the Guardian's office was, he was studying various different Hubbard advices, and he actually saw the advice where Hubbard says, for reporters, beat them up in a park and tell them not to report on Scientology. And he was like, I mean, that's when he was like, okay, I'm just going to stand back. And he kind of, that's when they lost his dedication as a Scientologist.
Wow. I've never heard that story before, Janis, and I've never heard that policy. So that is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I only heard it 2 weeks ago when I went to dinner with him.
Right.
Yeah. It's amazing, amazing the policies and the procedures that Hubbard had to fight any enemies, quote unquote, and enemies I use asterisks on. You know what I mean? It's basically anybody who speaks out about, hey, this isn't right. Sorry, that's my dog opening the door.
Yeah, that's right. Hubbard didn't like scrutiny, and it really went back to bad book reviews he got when Dianetics came out in the 1950s, and all that stuff. So when you see Tom Cruise go on about postnatal depression or psychiatric medicine or whatever, or antidepressants, that goes back to a series of bad book reviews that L. Ron Hubbard got in the 50s for Dianetics, where the medical establishment canned him. And so his decision after that was to go after the medical establishment, to say he wanted to abolish psychiatry. And so he was a hypersensitive man, as Janis knows intimately, and he did not like criticism, and he wanted to just destroy his critics. And so he went after journalists. He went after the medical establishment. That's why he went after psychologists and psychiatrists, because many of them called him on his bullshit in the 1950s and the 60s, and he didn't like it.
No. And then he was banned from several countries, first the United Kingdom, and then Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. And then he went to sea, and he basically was on the run, because people were after him.
Spain and Morocco.
That's right. And when you mentioned the Guardian's office before, and we can get into this if you want, the Guardian's office really was set up after a chain of events involving Australia, and in the Australian inquiry, the ban in Australia, and then there's an arc from what happened in Australia, and then some of that filtering into Britain, and he'd hired a private investigator in the UK because there was a British parliamentarian called Lord Balneil who got up in Parliament around the same time Janis was living in the UK at St Hill Manor, and he was getting up in Parliament and criticising Scientology. And they hired, this is before the Guardian's office, they hired a private investigator to spy on Lord Balneil. But then the private investigator didn't like what Scientology was doing. So he went public and spoke to a journalist in the UK. And then after that, Hubbard decided to set up his own intelligence agency, the Guardian's office. So that comes out of that arc going back to Australia. And because what Lord Balneil and other parliamentarians were doing in the UK was getting up in Parliament, people were asking questions about Scientology. And a lot of that had come from information they got from the Anderson Inquiry report in Australia, because there was an Australian journalist called Alex Mitchell who'd left Australia, taken a copy of the Anderson Inquiry and distributed it to journalists in the UK. And he went and worked on the Sunday Times and broke some really good stories about Scientology. He broke the story that linked Hubbard to Aleister Crowley, the occultist. And he also broke the story about overboarding going on in the harbour at Corfu. So Alex Alex Mitchell went to Corfu and witnessed that and wrote about it.
Oh.
And in fact, he saw, he was looking for Hubbard, and the way he described it, he said he saw a tubby man in a preposterous admiral's outfit, and he followed him. And he followed him, and he went to the Corfu casino, and Alex was not properly dressed to get into the room that Hubbard went into in the casino. So he waited in a little bar where they had a lower sense of dress standard, and he waited for Hubbard to go into the toilet. So while Hubbard was at the urinal having a leak, Alex Mitchell from the Sunday Times went up to him and started asking him questions.
Well, that's probably why he didn't go ashore anymore, because someone would find him.
Exactly.
Janis, were you on the ship in Corfu when you recall something like that happening?
I've heard about that, but
I meant about the overboarding, that there was a reporter there and all that. Did that ever come up while you were there?
No. Well, during the overboardings, the Greeks used to row up in their little boats, and some of them would line up there and just watch the overboarding. It was like their local entertainment.
But of course, Mark, there was, for the Australians, for Janis and for Peter and Terry, that overboarding probably wasn't so bad because they were good swimmers. But wasn't it the case, Janis? There was people who couldn't swim.
That's
who
right.
were thrown overboard.
Leon Steinberg, right?
Well, I remember watching Steiny. He didn't know how to swim, so instead of throwing him from the aft well deck, which was higher, they took him down to the cattle doors, which was maybe 4 feet off the water. 3 feet, and they put a life vest on him and threw him out. And I remember watching that life vest, like jolt his head off of his body type of thing. But it was just crazy.
Yeah. So, hey, let me ask you, Steve. Okay, so now an interesting part of this whole Australian inquiry I read, and a story that you sent to us, and also it kind of follows what you said, where they were investigating a member of parliament and all that. And it had to do with Rupert Murdoch, isn't that right?
That's right. So the investigation in Australia was in the 1960s, and it was in Victoria, and it was a one-man board of inquiry conducted by a prominent barrister called Kevin Anderson. And Rupert Murdoch claimed credit for that inquiry happening. I don't think he can claim credit for it, but entirely, because there was an interesting figure who we can talk about, a guy called Philip Wern, who was basically the disgruntled customer from hell who asked for a refund from Hubbard, and Hubbard wouldn't give it to him. So he then unleashed a kind of a revenge epic on Hubbard and took information to parliamentarians. And I believe that was the main driver of the inquiry. But Murdoch, in the early days, he was a young newspaperman in his 20s. He inherited the Adelaide News, a small newspaper, off his father, and he wanted to expand, and he started buying other newspapers up. And he bought a paper. The first big city newspaper he bought was the Sydney Daily Mirror, and with it came another newspaper called Truth. And Truth was a bit of a scandal sheet. But
a tabloid? Like a tabloid?
It was a tabloid, and it used to do it had a lot of racing form, it had a lot of pre-no-fault divorce, it had a lot of divorce court stories, a lot of scandal, but it also had a bit of a consumer affairs bent, where if anyone was getting ripped off, they would do stories. And so they approached it as a consumer affairs story, because they said people were getting ripped off and not being able to get their money back from Scientology. So Rupert Murdoch's Truth investigated Scientology in the 60s, and they at all times referred to it as bunkumology. And
I saw that, bunkumology,
And so they did a number of stories on it, and it was good reporting. It was, they focused on it, that this person said they were going to get this and said they were going to get that, and they never got what they paid for, and they wanted their money back. So it was basic consumer affairs reporting.
Was that mostly in Sydney?
That was in Melbourne. That was in Melbourne.
Okay.
So where the inquiry ended up happening. And so everyone will remember in 2012, I think it was, that Rupert Murdoch tweeted about Katie Holmes and Tom Cruise's divorce, and he started referring to Scientology as a crazy cult. And people are going, whoa, what's Murdoch doing tweeting about Scientology? And it goes back to then, when he had this tabloid, the Melbourne Truth, and they were exposing it. And he gave a lecture in 1972 where he claimed credit for the inquiry. As I said, I don't think he can claim total credit, but it certainly put it on the radar. and it got other parliamentarians interested, and they were reporting things too, like intimidation tactics of the Scientologists at the time, going after the local medical establishment, that kind of thing. So it definitely played a role. It was just not the only trigger for that inquiry. But one of the things that I found fascinating about this story was that, well, there's a few different things. I came across a private investigator called Rex Beaver, and
That's what I was going to ask you about. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I was looking up what we call the Hansard, the parliamentary records of debates, because Scientology got banned in Victoria, South Australia, and WA, 3 states in Australia, but not New South Wales.
WA is Western Australia.
Western Australia, that's right. But not New South Wales, which is where Sydney is and where I come from. So I looked up the old parliamentary records from the 1960s, and I thought, why wasn't it banned in New South Wales? What was going on? So I looked up the debates. Scientology was debated, and I came across this story that a private investigator called Rex Beaver had signed an affidavit and given it to his local politician, saying that he'd been hired to spy on, I think it was about 12 parliamentarians, members of the clergy, psychiatrists, psychologists, journalists, and Rupert Murdoch. And so this guy, Rex Beaver,
hired by Scientology, right? Hired by
the Church of Scientology. And
Right.
like, of course, the Church of Scientology denied this. When I went on the radio one time and said that they spied on Rupert Murdoch, and they said, well, that's not true. We never did. But Rex Beaver kept his pay slips, and they're in the book. So he's got his pay slips from the Church of Scientology. So they cannot deny that they hired him to spy on Rupert Murdoch and these other people. So this guy, Rex Beaver, was a bit of a no-nonsense character, and he didn't like the Scientologists and what they were doing once he got to know them. And so he went to Rupert Murdoch and said, do you want me to go double agent? I've been hired to spy on you. Do you want me to spy on them? Which is exactly what he did. Not dissimilar to the story I told before about the British private eye. He got exposed to them, didn't like their behavior, and wanted to expose their behavior. And so he's gone to Rupert Murdoch and Rupert Murdoch says, yeah, I'd love you to spy on them. So he then gathers information for Murdoch, and then a few weeks later, they splash on the front page of the Sunday Daily Mirror what Scientology was up to. Now, another really interesting part of that story is that the Church of Scientology blamed Rupert Murdoch for that inquiry. And Marty Rathbun, back when he was talking to journalists and giving them information before God knows whatever happened to him, he told me that he'd gone through the secret files of Scientology in California, and that they described Rupert Murdoch as this kind of overlord who was up there with, you know, the pharmaceutical industry, as one of the great evil figures who were trying to bring
world bankers,
all of them, Mark. So that's what Marty Rathbun told me, and he said that they tried to recruit Lachlan Murdoch, son of Rupert Murdoch, and one of the reasons that Tom Cruise helped recruit James Packer to Scientology, Marty told me at the time, was so they could try and get into Lachlan Murdoch through James Packer. Marty also told me that they believed that Scientology helped James Packer, and that there may have been some altruism involved in trying to get him better when he was in a difficult time in his life. But they also said it was a motivating force to try and get their claws into Lachlan Murdoch and to News Corporation. And that they thought if they could do that, that would be seeking revenge, you know, like it says in Hubbard's Manual of Justice, you know, even the score, you know, always seek revenge, even the score. And so that was Scientology trying to even the score for what they saw of Rupert Murdoch triggering that inquiry.
Yeah, and for our viewers, Rupert Murdoch, of course, he's a huge media mogul worldwide, but he's just recently announced that he's stepping down from his News Corp. And I think, isn't Lachlan Murdoch, isn't his son taking over, if I'm not mistaken?
Right. That's right. Yeah. So Rupert stepped down as chairman of Fox, and Lachlan's taking over. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. That's a crazy story. I think even when I read the article yesterday, didn't Rupert Murdoch even offer to this Mr. Beaver oh, why don't you take a picture of me walking out of a hotel with my secretary or something? In
Yeah,
other words, you're like on the reverse, the reverse spying.
Yeah, Rupert was in on it. He was trying to help Rex in any way he could, and Rex said, "No, that won't be necessary. You don't need to do that." He said, "Just give me a few little details, like where you live, where your yacht is moored." And it looks like then it helps him show the Scientologist he's still gathering information. So yeah, Rupert was all up for it, and he's had a very healthy dose of skepticism about Scientology ever since that moment.
Yeah. Janis just left us for a minute here, but anyway, carry on. So I was going to, it's an interesting story. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And that whole Truth tabloid or whatever is somehow contributed to, like you said, he may not have started the ban in whatever, the inquiry, but, I'm sure newspaper coverage feeds these things whenever they have stories that the public are interested in, right?
Definitely. Like newspapers put pressure on politicians, and that was an era when newspapers had more power. They had a greater readership, and it was the newspapers that really put the pressure on politicians. So yeah, there's no doubt that crusade of Murdoch's in the Truth newspaper and the crusade of his journalists in that newspaper had a result in an influence on triggering the first ever public inquiry into Scientology anywhere in the world.
Fabulous. Now, we're waiting for Janis. She's got disconnected somehow. She'll be back in a minute. But I also wanted to mention another story that you did that you sent to me, and I read it, and that has to do with somebody I knew, which is Chris Geider, who was a rugby player in Australia. Is that right?
That's right. And a very well-known rugby player. He retired at quite a young age to join the Sea Org. And he played professional rugby league in Sydney in the strongest competition in the world for this particular sport. So he's a very good athlete. And he became a Scientologist. And he also, one of the things that was really important about his story was he talked about witnessing Miscavige hitting people. And in my story, I didn't know you at the time, Mark, but I used your quotes from the St. Pete Times from an interview you must have given back then. Is that right?
That's right.
I'm going on memory. Yeah. And I remember talking to John Sweeney, who you probably would both know, who was the BBC Panoramas reporter, who's also done a book about Scientology. And in fact, I've seen John when we've both been reporting in Ukraine recently. And he's still doing a fantastic job. He's been in Ukraine for most of the war, an amazingly gutsy reporter. And he wanted to report in his first Panorama program about Miscavige beating people up. And I think he wanted to call his program the Thumping Pope of Scientology. But he couldn't get the evidence to go on the record to stack that up in his first program. He did it subsequently when he interviewed Mike Rinder later, or did other interviews with Mike when Mike was out. But it was kind of a big deal when we ran that story that Chris said that he witnessed Miscavige beating people up. And I used those quotes from you from the St. Pete Times.
You mentioned me by name.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's right. But the Church of Scientology at the time denied it. And what they do, for your viewers, is they issue legal threats. They issue affidavits from people who I've never met or spoken to. They issue a pile of them. And what they're trying to do is intimidate you. They're trying to show, well, that's not true. Here's all this evidence. So what I did was I then rang the Church of Scientology in California. And I said, well, I've got these affidavits. Can I talk to these people? Because I want to be able to test their claims. Because like people like Chris or people like Mike Rinder, who I'd spoken to in stories around that time as well, they were always open for me to interrogate them about their claims. They were always available. They fronted up, they went on camera, they were happy to answer uncomfortable questions. But these people who I didn't even know whether they signed these affidavits. How do I know that somebody in the Office of Public Affairs hasn't just typed them up and sent them to me?
Right.
So when I tried to test these so-called affidavits, they wouldn't put me through to the individuals, so I couldn't even talk to them on the telephone. And then they said that my behavior was inappropriate in even calling them and trying to talk to those people. So we thought, that what Chris said was accurate. We used those quotes of yours, Mark, from the St. Pete Times. So we thought there was evidence of Miscavige, and we all know of Miscavige beating people up. And he does not put himself up to public scrutiny. That last interview he did was with Ted Koppel, which I think was in 1992. Was that the,
you're right.
It was so long ago. And Ted Koppel did a very good job of that interview. But we know so much more about Scientology now. And wouldn't it be great to get Miscavige on camera for an interview? But he's a coward.
Absolutely.
He won't do it. He's a coward.
Well,
sorry, Janis.
Let me put out the challenge. David Miscavige, we would be willing to interview you. You know how to reach us.
Yeah, front up.
Yeah, we'll definitely do that.
Don't be such a wimp. Front up.
That's true.
And what's wrong with him? Like, seriously, he spent his whole life bullying people, beating people up, enslaving them, making them, I remember the story that Terry told me, Janis, your sister, of him making her move rocks from one part of a compound to another, just to humiliate her. And to me, it's almost a form of torture. Like, what? But he won't ever do an interview again. He never will do an interview again. I'd love to see him in court as well. I'd love to see him cross-examine.
That's the thing that he's deathly afraid of, because if he gets under oath, I mean, he's really in for it, because he'll perjure himself, and there's lots of people that will testify against him. But just to back up what you said about the story about Terry, I mean, that was basically when he attacked me. That was the end pretty much for me, because it wasn't about a month or so later that I escaped for good. And I had already escaped once, but I came back because I wanted to be with my wife. And Chris was one of the people there when it happened, and absolutely it happened just exactly that way. But he started doing these demeaning things, like he had me go up about a month or two before that, when he got upset at me over something, and he had me get one of those lint rollers, and I had to get down on my hands and knees and lint roll all the dog hair off of his office carpet, and I went, this is not going to happen. I mean, I did it, but I was like, I'm done. This is not Scientology. This is not what I signed up for, and it wasn't there at all that he beat me up. Yeah,
another story Terry told me was that Miscavige wanted Terry to spit in the face of, was it Homer Schomer?
Homer Schomer.
Yeah.
And Terry refused to spit in his face. Like, what is wrong with that guy? I mean,
exactly.
Steve, you bring up an interesting point, which is that people who would not agree with him to do things like that, he would back off, or he'd get, it's the people standing around that basically let him do that. I mean, I had, Miscavige physically attacked somebody in his office about 5 or 6 years prior to that, when I worked for him, and I was in there with Shelley Miscavige, and he leapt across his desk at somebody and grabbed them. And Shelley and I both went, Dave, and we went and we grabbed him and pulled him back, That stopped happening, and that's what's so crazy about the spitting in the face. Are you kidding me? Some of these people that were in the hole later on and all that, they went along with this stuff. I feel sorry for them, because, Biddy Miscavige is somebody that was David Miscavige's sister-in-law, former sister-in-law. We interviewed her recently, and she said the first time she saw him kick and beat a staff member when she was in Religious Technology Center, she told him, Dave, what the hell are you doing? In other words, stand up to him. And she said he backed off because he is a coward. He really is a coward. The only reason that he has any power is because he has an entourage behind him that will back him up,
Yes.
So anyway, that's my 2 cents. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was going to say about Chris Geider, just a nice story, okay? Because he literally had just arrived at the secret base in Gillham Hot Springs about 2 or 3 months before I finally was, removed and then finally left, right? and he was brought up there to be a master at arms, which is basically an ethics officer. And they gave him a swizzle stick, like almost like a riding crop to ride around with. And he was supposed to keep people on schedule. That was his job, keep people on schedule and doing their jobs. But anyway, yeah, he was down there and he witnessed that. But I felt sorry for him because they then sent him to try and handle me, handle my ethics and to get me in. And it would be like, look, I'm not tooting my own horn, but I worked for the top guy for 6 years, right? He was brand new there. He didn't know anything that had happened at that base at that time. So really, I just kind of said, look at, no offense here, but you're not going to be able to handle me because I can't tell you things that have happened because you wouldn't understand them because you weren't here. And so they eventually had to send somebody who was more along the lines of my position in order to try and handle me. But Chris was a really nice guy, and he's got a tremendous story as well to tell. But that was my experiences with Chris Geider, and Chris, I'm happy that he's out. Yeah.
Chris was sent to the RPF in Australia, where Miscavige started using Australia like it was a penal colony and dumping people in the RPF in Western Sydney. Now, my understanding is that we did a lot of stories on what was going on at the RPF, and I don't know if that had an impact on it being shut down in Western Sydney. But I just want to pay tribute to people like Chris and to all the people I've spoken to over the years who've blown the whistle on Scientology, because it takes a lot of courage to speak up. There are repercussions. People can be disconnected from their family. People can have private investigators put on them, and we don't know the truth until people like this speak up, right? Yeah. And for me, all these stories that have come out, they've killed Scientology's business model. It's virtually impossible to recruit now, and that means less people get exposed to the abuses that the people who've got out were exposed to. So it's a real credit to the people who've spoken out over the years about abuses inside Scientology.
Yeah, and a lot of the abuses that have been spoken out about, like you said, have made changes. Like supposedly the hole was shut down once it was exposed. Like you said, the rehabilitation project force in Australia, it must have been disbanded after that reporting came out, because Miscavige can't have that kind of, information out there. And then we just heard a story recently about elder abuse here in Los Angeles, where the woman, she was a Sea Org member, and they basically took $160,000 from her credit cards illegally, and she got out and challenged them, and they gave her back the money just recently. So they're trying to brush this stuff under the rug, absolutely, because they're vulnerable to it.
Her son got her out.
Right.
He did a whole espionage. He's been in the military lately, and he sent in a mission to extract her.
Wow, good on him. That's brave.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's crazy, but I was going to ask you, were you fair game followed? Did you have family members contacted and business associates because of your reporting?
I assumed that I was being followed in some way, and I never put anything in my rubbish bin, for example. I had a very good shredder.
I don't know what they would ever think that they would find there. I guess unless you had paper documents, but still.
Yeah, exactly. There was one thing that did pop up, which was interesting. It wasn't really scary or anything, but the State Library of New South Wales, the family history section, somebody came in there one day wanting to look up my family tree. And bizarrely, the woman who was on the family history desk at the library that day was a former Scientologist. And she reported it to me that somebody had come in wanting to look at my family tree, who, in her words, looked like a Scientologist and dressed like a Scientologist. So that was one piece of evidence that I got that people were trying to look into me. I was never subject to a noisy investigation. For any viewers who may not understand what that is, that's when Scientologists or private investigators get in your face and try and make you commit a crime, basically. Try and get you to lash out so they can then say you're a criminal. They did it a lot with Marty Rathbun. What would they call them? The squirrel busters. They were outside.
Yeah,
that's right.
Squirrel busters.
And John Sweeney too. When Tommy Davis, that's a famous one as well.
Exactly. So I never got subjected to any of that. I just assumed that they had private investigators on me, but I wasn't too worried about it. But that's the only real piece of evidence that I got, was that family history thing in the library.
Okay, good. Now, what caused you to go ahead and write a book and write the story? What all was entailed with that, and did you get a lot of pushback on that as well?
Well, I've got to give a bit of credit to Mike Rinder for getting me to write this book, really, because Mike was very helpful to me when I started reporting on Scientology. And as an outsider, when you're a journalist, it's a very difficult organization to report on because it's so secretive. It tries to intimidate you, but also there's a language that's used that is hard to understand.
Yes.
Right?
Our viewers know that.
Yeah. And also, even for me, one of the most important things I did in my reporting was read Introduction to Ethics, because then I could understand Scientology's internal justice system. And once I worked out, which is broken into high crimes, crimes, misdemeanors, and errors. And when I looked through the high crimes and saw that a lot of the high crimes were things like speaking to a public inquiry, blowing the whistle on Scientology. So anything which tells the truth about Scientology and gives it bad public relations is considered a high crime. And from memory, I think having sex with a minor was only a crime. You know, so it's like bad PR is worse than statutory rape. You know, how does that work? So, so once I kind of understood that element about Scientology's internal justice system, and the fact that Hubbard referred to our legal system as WOG justice, which shows the contempt that he had for our legal system, it gave me that was a really important handle on reporting on Scientology, because I knew that they would say anything to keep Scientology in good standing. So I found that really insightful. So, but I relied on Mike a lot on my early stories, just fact checking a few things and going, so-and-so said this, what do you think about this? And he would be able to give me the context. But also one of the things that he told me was that Australia had a very unique history in relation to Scientology. The first country in the world to have a public inquiry, the first country in the world where Scientology was banned in those 3 states I mentioned before. Also the first country in the world where the highest court in the land recognized Scientology as a religion. That happened in 1983 in Australia. And he talked about also the significant characters who'd played important roles in Scientology who were from Australia, like Janis's mum Yvonne, who set up the Celebrity Centre, like Mike himself. He didn't say that, obviously. You know, of course, there was Nicole Kidman's interaction with Tom Cruise. There was Rupert Murdoch's collisions with Scientology. Julian Assange was involved in exposing Scientology quite early on. One of the first things he did on WikiLeaks was publish all the OT levels. So there was this really rich history involving Australia. Of course, Hubbard served in Australia briefly during World War II in Brisbane. Mm-hmm. He went out and spoke in Melbourne in the 50s, and Janis's parents probably were at that event, were they?
Yes,
Janis?
yes,
Yeah.
they were there.
Yeah.
And that's where they met David Mayo. David Mayo was there at 19 years old.
Okay, wow. Who became very famous in Scientology as an auditor. And
yep.
Yeah, so there was this fascinating stream of history involving Australia. And I also thought no one else is going to write this book. So I felt I had to do it. And it took me 4 years to write it. And I don't mean full time, because I was doing my job, but I was dipping in and out of it. And so that's why I just decided to write it, because I just felt like the story was incredibly rich. It needed to be told. I was motivated by their attempts to try and silence me. And I just thought it's an important history to tell. So for all of those reasons, I got into it. And
how did you get turned on to Janis and her sister Terry as sources for stories and information? How did that happen?
So I was very aware of the Gillham family's role in Scientology, because I just kept reading, and and so I was reading about the inquiry, and I took photos of Janis's father's testimony to the inquiry. I went to the Office of Public Records in Victoria, and they've got all the transcripts of the inquiry. There's millions of words. The inquiry went for over a year. It's fascinating. And so wow. I took photos of some of those testimonies and sent them to Janis when I was doing that. And so I can't remember who put me in contact with Janis, but Janis was very generous in talking to me, and same with Terry, and same with Peter and their father Peter as well. And so it was a real privilege to me to be able to tell their stories in that book, and to meet them both in Las Vegas. And I can tell you that story too, if you want me.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was going to say, did you do this all over the phone or the internet, or how did you do this?
Well, Janis can jump in. Janis can jump in at any time and give us her version of events. But initially, I spoke to Janis over the phone. I'm pretty sure Janis was the first of the Gillham siblings that I spoke to, and later on, I spoke to Terry, and I think I spoke to Peter third. And we agreed just to talk at the beginning, and I took notes, and it was all off the record until they were ready for it to be on the record. And I understood that, and I respected it, because I was aware of their story of having Scientology private eyes infiltrate their business. I was aware of the risks that they faced on that kind of level, and what a big step it is to talk publicly about something even when you haven't spoken publicly about something, they try and infiltrate your business in the way that they did. So, eventually in 2015, I went to a Scientology conference in Canada. And when I say Scientology conference, it was a conference of critics of Scientology. Right. And John Atack, who wrote A Piece of Blue Sky, which is a great book I really recommend to anyone who wants to know about Scientology history. He organized this conference. I was a speaker there. And while I was there, I said to Janis, I could just fly down from Toronto and come and say hi, and we can talk. So I met Janis at an all-you-can-eat buffet in a Las Vegas casino. And
the Suncoast.
Okay. So I remember this vividly. It was funny. I flew into Las Vegas. The plane was about to land, and it aborted the landing because there was another plane on the tarmac. So that was an interesting entree into Las Vegas already. Then we got down the second time, and then I went to say the casino again, Janis, the
Suncoast.
The Suncoast. So I got in late, and I wake up and I open the curtains, and I think I can see a golf course, but I also think I can see a woman getting out of her car in what looks like a Playboy bunny outfit. Janis, do they all wear that, get up in that casino? Or?
Waitresses.
Right. And I just thought, am I on another planet? Where? And so then I met Janis downstairs at the buffet, and Janis was great. It was really nice to meet Janis, and she said she was fine with everything she said to me going on the record, which was really a real relief to me, because she'd said so much important stuff. I thought it was really important that her story got out. And then I was due to meet Terry, Janis's sister. And Janis, you can jump in and give your version of this at any point, but my memory of it was that I had to ring Terry. Terry said to me something like, I'll be in this colored car on level 2 of the car park. I'll pick you up in 5 minutes. Make sure you're not followed. And she said it in a way that it was so no nonsense. I just thought, yeah, I'm going to make sure I'm not followed, because otherwise I'll be in big trouble from Terry. Terry then took me to a cheesecake shop in an industrial estate somewhere around Las Vegas, and we sat down and talked. And Terry was interrogating me about what I was doing with my book, and she's asking me good questions, the kind of questions you should ask a journalist. It was great. And then she just said to me, "Okay, show me something you've written," because I explained to her that I'd already written large parts of the book, and that I was really hoping that things that she'd said to me could go on the record. And I don't know why this happened, but but she started reading a chapter. It may have just been the chapter that was open. And it was about L. Ron Hubbard going to Tangiers in Morocco and taking a lot of drugs and writing OT3. And I still remember Terry going, I didn't know about this. And then she kept reading. She said, I had no idea about this. And so I feel like, and you know, you'd have to get Terry's version of this. I felt like Terry after that could see that I'd done the research and I wasn't mucking around and I was treating it seriously. And then she agreed for her story to go on the record too. And I felt really blessed that Terry, Janis, Peter, all were happy to tell their stories, their escape stories, their stories, Terry's and Janis' stories of what it was like to be Hubbard's messengers as girls. Like really, really important stories in Scientology history. So yeah, I remember that day well, and it was really important. And I think the story on Terry and Janis and Peter leaving Scientology, I think it's the largest chapter in my book because it needed to be, because it's such an epic story or epic stories. So that's my memory of it, Janis. That's my memory of meeting you in Las Vegas.
Yes, and I remember the same thing, and I remember hearing those other parts with Terry's meeting. And I think you were the first reporter that Terry ever opened up to. She had not met with any other reporters before. You were the first one. So well done.
Yeah, thank you. And I felt very privileged about that. And yeah, no, it was great. And it was so good for you all to get your story out like that. And yeah, it was important for me. And that was one of the advantages of writing a book over a period of years, was that you can talk to people and build their trust. And then when they feel ready to talk or ready to go on the record, you know, you've got the time. There's not so much of a rush. Right. So it was an advantage.
No, and it's I know exactly what you're talking about. I spoke to Andrew Morton off the record when he did his book on his biography on Tom Cruise, because I was there when David Miscavige first met Tom Cruise. So I know what you're talking about. And then I was also off the record with Janet Reitman, who wrote a book about Scientology for Rolling Stone. But then I finally went on the record, you know, later on with other books and other stories and stuff. It just it takes time. You know, part of the problem is that, you know, we have lives outside of, you know, talking about Scientology, and we also have family, friends, and you know, that those get affected because they came after us hard with private investigators and tried to destroy our businesses, tried to bankrupt me and basically get me in trouble. And you know, it's hard to forget that, you know, but now I'm old enough that I don't care. So now I can say whatever I want, you know. I mean, I got.
And that must be very liberating.
Yeah, that's what kind of timing wise, that's what worked out as to why we could start this channel. Is that you know, Janis is in a certain point in her life, and I am too, and we can tell these stories freely and not really worry about what's going to happen, you know. So
well, I do feel guilty sometimes doing this because people think I should be working on my third book. This is so much easier than writing a book.
It is.
And then my viewers are talking to me, trying to say, hey, why don't you write a book? And I always thought, God, I have so much time and this and that and da, da, da. But I kind of figured out a way that I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell a bunch of short stories, you know, almost like self-contained little chapters, and just make it like an anthology type of thing, because it's hard. Like, I'm sure you know, Steve, you've written a lot of things, just chronologically and researching and putting things so that they're accurate. It takes a lot of time, and you have another job, and so we did as well. So, you know.
And I think what you're describing, Mark, is a good way. It's like almost like it doesn't have to be a chronological biography. It can be a memoir with certain chapters that are reflections of a certain time in your life or a certain event. And I think I've read memoirs like that are great. You know, where that person just writes a chapter about. It could have been about a day, or it could have been about an event, or whatever. But it's not a bad way of writing a book.
Yeah, and we're actually pretty fascinated that there's such a big audience for this. You know, I mean, you know, after Scientology's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, you know, but there's a fascination with this whole subject, which we weren't really fully aware of, and that's why we have a lot of viewers and we have a lot of subscribers, and it's pretty interesting. You know, people are interested in this. You know.
Yeah, I mean, Scientology ticks a lot of boxes for public interest, I think, because any organization that is secretive, people want to know about, because automatically people are hiding the truth and people want to know what the truth is in a secretive organization. Then you get the celebrity element, so people are interested in that. That over the years, there's been Hollywood stars involved in Scientology. And also there's the public interest aspect about issues of abuse of power and also receiving taxpayers' money. So having a tax deduction, which Scientology should not have. If you think of how much money they save by not paying tax, and how that then is paid to private investigators to harass people, that is a disgrace.
Yes.
You've got public money subsidizing harassment. So for all of those reasons, I think there is a fascination with Scientology, and that's why it's really important to talk about it. It's important to talk about any organization where there is an abuse of power going on, and there's plenty of that has been going on and continues to go on inside the Church of Scientology.
Yeah. You know, you bring up a good point on the support of the Scientology public, their money being used to get PIs and to do investigations and harass people like you, like us. And that was one of the key points we used on my dad to get him out, because he was a heavy, heavy donor. And then we pointed out, Dad, that money is being used to harass us and ruin our lives.
Wow.
And he had no idea. He had no idea. And that's when we were like, we started pointing things out to him. And that's where he still, to the day he died, he still believed in Scientology technology and auditing and that type of thing. But he was not supporting Scientology anymore because of their criminality and abuse.
Yeah. And I know from speaking to him too, and also speaking to your brother Peter too, about the abuse that he suffered when he was on the Apollo and being separated from his family. And so it was a different form of abuse than what was going on with Miscavige. But that was a form of abuse too, like dragging your mother away from her children.
Yes, but my brother was chain locked at 14 or 15 years old by Hannah when she was the captain of the Avon River. You know, so he was abused as a child with the chain locker.
Yeah. No, that sounded like an appalling. I heard many stories about people shoved in the chain locker.
Yeah.
And it was dangerous too. Imagine if they dropped the anchor.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I remember Amos Jessup told me that one time he dropped the anchor on the Avon, not knowing someone was in the chain locker, and it was Bo Walters. And when Bo got out, he just yelled at Amos, "You could have killed me." And he was just hanging, you know, as close as he could to the bulkhead in the locker.
Crazy. Yeah. What did you think of Janis's father, Peter? To me, he was a legend. Do you know what I mean? I met him when I was 16 years old. I took a seminar in Washington, D.C. with him. And boy, he was one of the greatest public speakers I've ever seen. And he's legendary in Scientology, and as well as with his vitamins and his nutrition and this and that. So when I finally saw him after he was out, I was like still in awe of him, because he just had such a presence about him, as did Janis's mother.
So I only spoke to Peter Sr. once, and he would have been in his 80s at the time, but his memory was excellent. He had incredible.
To the day he died.
Really sharp.
To the day he died, he had a great memory.
Yeah, his recall and his the detail was very, very strong.
Yeah.
And I'd also read his testimony in the Anderson inquiry as well. And so, yeah, it was great to talk to him, because he'd lived through that as an adult. Obviously, Janis lived through it as a child. And I remember Janis telling me being at an athletics carnival and suddenly kids not talking to you, other kids at Glenferrie Primary School not talking to Janis. But Peter lived that life too, of being one of the key witnesses at the inquiry and having to deal with the prejudice against Scientologists that was shone on them at the time for their belief system in that inquiry, and so they were suddenly, being mocked in the inquiry and in the media. And look, there was legitimate scrutiny, but sometimes that was stepping over the line too, and they had to deal with the blowback of that.
Yeah. Well, we're reached here the end of our hour. I wanted to, we're going to definitely do some more with you, Steve, because we've got other things that we'd like to talk to you about.
Yeah.
But before we go, I want to just mention again, this is Steve's book that you can get. It's called Fair Game by Steve Cannane, and you can order it. It's available on Amazon.com if you want to order it and read his book. I'm sure I actually am going to, I've never read it, Steve, so I'm definitely getting it, and I'll probably borrow Janis's or I'll buy one. But yeah, I want to read it for sure. Janis has got it right there. And then also, just so people know, Janis's book, Commoner's Messenger, Book 1, that's Janis at 12 or 13, walking with L. Ron Hubbard on the flagship Apollo, a child adrift in Scientology's organization. That's available on our merchandise site. If you go down below the comments, it's actually featured there. So if you're interested in getting an autographed copy of her book 1 or her book 2, it's available right there, and she'll autograph it for you and send it out. So both of that book is available as well. Steve, we want to thank you so much for being here. I've got 2 more bits of business, and then when we end, we'll still stay on after I stop the recording. Okay. Please subscribe to our channel, everybody, at Mark Fisher and Janis Gillham Grady. We get the word out. More and more people can see these stories. Hopefully you find them interesting. And also, if you have any questions on this video, ask in the comment section. We're going to be doing other interviews with Steve, and then we're going to do eventually a live question and answer with our viewers, where we can ask him the questions, and you can actually ask them as viewers in our live chat. So we just wanted to mention that. And Janis, what else is everybody supposed to do?
Rock slam that like button.
That's right. Rock slam that like button. The likes help us. It helps YouTube and other viewers find us. So please rock slam away. Okay. Anyway, Steve, that's our little business we have to do here. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we end off right now?
Well, I just really enjoyed talking to you both, and look forward to chatting again.
Yeah,
Fabulous,
I
Steve.
Enjoyed it too.
I
Thank
did too,
you,
and we
Steve.
just scratched the surface. I have lots of other things we'd like to ask you about as well, and it's great talking to you. And please be safe over there when you're in Ukraine, covering the war there. But anyway,
thanks very much.
Stick around, Steve. We'll be right back with you. Until then, everybody, we want to say bye-bye. We'll see you later.
Bye.